So, what was this dance of death? It was an idea, mostly, an allegory. It showed up in paintings, poems, and plays all over late medieval Europe. The main picture is simple. You have a line of people, they are from every part of society. Basically, a pope, an emperor, a king, a knight, a merchant, a farmer, a beggar, a tiny baby. And in between each of these living people is a skeleton, or maybe a decaying corpse. This figure of death is leading them all in a dance. He's often grinning, playing a musical instrument, pulling them along. The living look surprised or scared or reluctant. They don't want to go, but they have no choice. The dance wasn't a real event. No one was actually dancing with skeletons in the town square. It was a picture of a truth that medieval people were thinking about a lot. The message was blunt. His death comes for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're powerful or poor. It doesn't care if you're a holy man or a sinner. It doesn't care if you're old or young. Your money can't buy you out of it. Your title doesn't give you a pass. In life, there was a strict hierarchy. The king was on top, the peasant was at the bottom. Everyone knew their place. But in the dance of death, everyone is equal. They are all just partners for a skeleton. The dance leads to one place, the grave. This idea is often called the danse macabre. That's the French term. It became the most common name for it. The word macabre itself is a bit of a mystery. No one is totally sure where it comes from, but it came to mean anything connected to the grim or gruesome side of death. And the dance was certainly that. The skeletons were not peaceful, gentle guides. They were active, energetic, almost joyful in their work. They mock the people they lead. They pull on the king's ermine robes. They tug at the merchant's coin purse. They remind each person that all the things they valued in life are now useless. The setting was often a cemetery. Early versions were painted on the walls of churchyards. This was a public space. People gathered there. It was a constant visible reminder. Imagine walking past that every day. A long mural showing your local bishop, the lord of the manor, the baker, all being dragged away by grinning corpses. It was meant to be unsettling. It was a form of public sermon, a visual warning. Be prepared, live a good life, because you don't know when death will show up and ask you to dance. The figures in the dance were types, not individuals. You had the pope, not a specific pope. You had the farmer, not a man named John. This was important. It meant anyone could see themselves in the procession. The pope represented the height of spiritual power. The emperor, the height of worldly power. Death could take them. It could certainly take you. Each person in the line would often have a short bit of text with them, like a caption. Death would speak, saying something like, "Mr. Merchant, you spent your life counting gold, but you can't take it with you." And the merchant would reply, pleading for more time, complaining that he was taken too soon. This dialogue made the lesson personal. It showed the vanity of earthly concerns. All the things people worry about, fight over, and work for. Death just laughs at it. In the end, everyone just becomes another skeleton. The great equalizer, that was the core of the dance of death. A simple, powerful, and very unsettling idea. Why did this idea become so popular? Why were people in the 14th and 15th centuries so obsessed with this specific image? The answer is that their world was full of death. Not just the usual, expected kind of death, but sudden, unpredictable, and massive death. The main reason was the Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe in the mid-1300s. It was a catastrophe on a scale that's hard to imagine. It swept across the continent, killing a huge portion of the population. Some historians think it killed a third of all people. In some towns and cities, it was more than half. This wasn't a slow, dignified end. It was fast, ugly, and painful. People could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. No one knew what caused it. No one knew how to stop it. It seemed completely random. And it killed the rich and the poor, the good and the bad. One day, your whole family could be alive. The next week, you could be the only one left. This changed how people thought about life and death. Before the plague, death was a familiar part of life, but it had a certain order to it. Now, it was a constant, terrifying presence. The sheer number of dead bodies was overwhelming. Mass graves were dug. Old social rules broke down. The normal rituals of dying, of last rites and proper burials often had to be abandoned. This experience created a deep psychological shock. It made death feel immediate and arbitrary. The old idea that you could prepare for a good death seemed like a joke when death could snatch you from the street at any moment. The Dance of Death was a perfect way to process this trauma. It gave a kind of order to the chaos. Well, it wasn't just random sickness, it was a force, a character. Death itself was now a personality. a grinning skeleton who actively came for you. The dance showed exactly what people were seeing in real life. Death did not respect social status. The plague killed priests and nobles just as easily as it killed peasants. The image of the Pope and the Emperor being led away by a corpse reflected this reality. It was a dark comfort in a way. It confirmed that the universe, at least in death, was fair. The injustice of life was balanced by the equality of the grave, but it wasn't just the plague. The late Middle Ages were a tough time in general. The Hundred Years' War between England and France dragged on for generations, bringing destruction and instability. Famines were common. The climate was getting colder, leading to crop failures. Social unrest was bubbling up. Peasants were revolting against their lords. The world felt like it was in a state of crisis. Even the church, the main source of stability and comfort, was in trouble. The Pope had moved from Rome to Avignon in France, which many saw as a scandal. Then there was the Great Schism, a period when there were two and later three rival popes, all claiming to be the true one. This chaos at the top of the Christian world shook people's faith. If you couldn't trust the church to be stable, what could you trust? All of this contributed to a feeling of anxiety and pessimism. People were thinking about the end of the world, about judgment, about the state of their souls. The Dance of Death fit this mood perfectly. It was a memento mori, a reminder of mortality. It said, "Look at this broken world. Look at all this chaos. None of it matters in the long run. The only thing that matters is that you will die, and you will be judged." So the dance wasn't just about the plague, it was a response to a whole world that felt fragile and unpredictable. It was an expression of the anxieties of an entire age. So how did people encounter this idea? It wasn't something you just read about in a book. For most people who couldn't read anyway, it was a very public and visual experience. The Dance of Death was spread through several different forms, each reaching a different audience. The most famous and powerful versions were large murals. These were painted on the walls of churches, or, more commonly, on the walls surrounding cemeteries. The most influential one was at the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, painted in the 1420s. This was a major public place. It was a graveyard, but it was also a market and a social gathering spot. People walked by this mural every single day. It was a huge, long painting showing the familiar procession. A line of living figures, each paired with a skeleton, stretched across the wall. It was impossible to ignore. It had text below the images, a poem with verses for each character. A priest would probably have read these aloud for the illiterate. This mural in Paris became a kind of blueprint. Artists from other parts of Europe heard about it or saw sketches of it, and they created their own versions in their own towns. There were famous dances in London, in Germany, in Switzerland. Seeing it as a massive painting made it communal. It wasn't a private thought, it was a public statement. Besides murals, the Dance of Death also appeared in sermons. Priests would use the image in their preaching to warn their congregations about sin and vanity. They would describe the scene, the proud king being humbled, the greedy merchant losing his wealth. It was a powerful rhetorical tool. It made the abstract idea of death and judgment very concrete and immediate. The sermon was a major form of entertainment and information in the Middle Ages, so this theme would have reached thousands of people who might never see one of the famous murals. It became part of the oral culture. Then a new technology came along that changed everything: the printing press. In the late 15th century, it became possible to make books and prints cheaply. The Dance of Death was a perfect subject for this new medium, and woodcuts were easy to produce. An artist would carve the image into a block of wood, which could then be used to print hundreds of copies. Suddenly, the Dance of Death could be inside your home. You could own a small book with a series of these images. The most famous printed version was created by the artist Hans Holbein the Younger in the 1520s. This was a bit later, on the cusp of the Renaissance and Reformation, but it was the high point of the tradition. Holbein's Dance of Death was a series of detailed, powerful woodcuts. Each print was a little drama. Instead of a long procession, he showed death surprising each person in the middle of their daily life. Death bursts into the judge's courtroom. He snatches the hat from a cardinal's head. He comes for a plowman in his field. He even appears as a skeleton playing a drum in an infant's nursery. And Holbein's work was incredibly popular. It was printed and reprinted all over Europe. This series of prints cemented the Dance of Death as a major theme in Western art. It moved from being a public, church-sponsored mural to a more personal, private work of art that people could reflect on in their own time. So the idea was everywhere. It was on the walls you walked past, in the sermons you heard on Sunday, and in the books and prints you might see in a wealthy person's home. It started as a public spectacle and evolved into a private meditation. But the form didn't matter as much as the core message. Whether painted, preached, or printed, it always showed the same thing: the strange, democratic, and unstoppable parade of life towards death. Let's look closer at the characters in the dance. The power of the image came from its cast. It was a cross-section of medieval society, a mirror held up to the world, and the interactions between death and each of these characters revealed what the society valued and what it criticized. The procession almost always began at the top. The first to be led away were the most powerful people on earth. First, the Pope. He was God's representative, the head of the church. In the dance, he's shown wearing his triple crown and fine vestments. But the skeleton pulling him along doesn't care. Death often tugs at his robes or mocks his authority. The message was clear: even the holiest man on earth cannot escape his mortal end. His spiritual power provides no special protection. This could be a comforting thought for the common person, but it was also a warning to the clergy not to become too proud. Next came the emperor. He was the most powerful secular ruler, the head of the Holy Roman Empire. He wears a crown and holds a scepter and orb, the symbols of his dominion over the world. But death treats him just like everyone else. The skeleton might grab his crown or lead him away by the hand as if he were a child. The commentary here is about the vanity of worldly power. All your armies, all your castles, all your lands, they mean nothing when your time is up. After the top two, the parade of elites continued. You would see a king, often looking shocked that he is being treated this way. A cardinal, his red robes a stark contrast to the pale bones of his partner. A bishop and abbot, all the powerful figures of the church. Then came the secular lords, a duke, a knight. The knight is an interesting one. He's a professional warrior, a man whose life is about dealing out death. Yet here he is, helpless against it himself. His armor and sword are useless. Death often breaks his lance or leads him away from a battle he thinks he's winning. Then the dance moves down the social ladder. We see the professional classes. A doctor stands by a sickbed, but he cannot cure the ultimate sickness. Death often appears as an assistant, gleefully pointing out the doctor's failure. A lawyer is shown with his books and papers, arguing a case, but there is no argument he can make to death. His legal tricks are worthless. A rich merchant is seen counting his gold. Death sneaks up and snatches a coin or starts leading him away from his treasure. He can't bribe his way out. The common people were represented too. A farmer is shown working his field. Death might take his plow. The farmer's reaction is often one of weary acceptance. His life was hard, and death is just another part of the cycle. You might see a craftsman, like a weaver or a stonemason, pulled away from his work. And then there were the women, a queen, an abbess, a noble lady admiring herself in a mirror. Death often appears behind her, a skeletal reflection showing her what she will become. A young maiden is taken away from her lover. The dance shows that love, beauty, and youth are just as fleeting as power and wealth. Finally, the procession would end with the weakest and most vulnerable. A beggar or a cripple might be in the line. For them, death is sometimes portrayed as a release from a life of suffering. At the very end, you often find a small child or even a baby in a cradle. This was perhaps the most shocking and poignant image. It showed that death was not just the end of a long life. It could come at the very beginning. It spared no one. Innocence was no defense. Each of these pairings was a little story, a small morality play. The dialogue that often went with the images would have death taunting the living and the living responding with regret, fear, or defiance. It was social satire. It pointed a finger at the pride of the powerful, the greed of the merchant, the vanity of the beautiful. But it wasn't just about criticizing society, it was also about a shared human condition. Everyone in that line, from the Pope to the peasant, was united by their mortality. And in a world with rigid social divisions, that was a radical and powerful idea. So what happened to the Dance of Death? Did it just vanish when the Middle Ages ended? Not at all. The theme was too powerful to just disappear. It adapted and changed with the times, and its echoes can still be found today. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the Reformation, the way people thought about death started to shift. There was a new emphasis on the individual and on human achievement, but the Dance of Death didn't go away, it just got more personal. We see this in Holbein's famous woodcuts. His work marks a transition. It's no longer a public communal procession on a church wall. It's a series of private, dramatic moments in a book. Death is no longer leading a dance, he's an intruder and ambusher. This shift reflects a changing worldview, one more focused on individual lives and destinies. The theme continued to pop up in art and literature. Shakespeare's plays are full of meditations on death, skulls, and the decay of the body, like the famous gravedigger scene in Hamlet. The idea of the great equalizer remained a potent one. The Baroque period in art had its own version, the Vanitas paintings. These were still lifes filled with symbolic objects, a skull, an hourglass, a guttering candle, wilting flowers. They were beautiful, but they carried the same message as the old mural's life is short, beauty fades, and earthly pleasures are temporary. In the 19th century, during the Romantic era, there was a renewed fascination with the medieval, the Gothic, and the macabre. The Dance of Death found new life in music. The composer Franz Liszt wrote his Totentanz, a powerful and dramatic piece for piano and orchestra. Camille Saint-Saëns composed his famous Danse Macabre, a symphonic poem where you can hear Death tuning his fiddle and skeletons dancing in a graveyard at midnight. These pieces took the old visual idea and turned it into an auditory experience. Writers and poets also picked up the theme. It fit perfectly with the romantic obsession with emotion, mortality, and the supernatural. And the dance continues into the modern era. You can see its influence in films. Ingmar Bergman's classic movie, The Seventh Seal, is probably the most direct example. The film is set in Sweden during the Black Death. The main character, a knight, plays a game of chess with a personified death. And the film ends with one of the most famous images in cinema, a stark silhouette of the characters on a hillside being led away by death in a solemn, silent dance. It's a direct homage to the medieval murals. The theme's core message is timeless, so it keeps reappearing in different forms. Every time society gets a sharp reminder of its own fragility, whether through a pandemic, a war, or some other crisis, the idea of the Dance of Death feels relevant again. It's there in heavy metal album art, in graphic novels, in Halloween traditions. The grinning skeleton is still a powerful symbol. What started as a response to the specific horrors of the late Middle Ages turned into a fundamental part of Western culture's way of thinking about mortality. It's a way of confronting a difficult truth with a kind of dark humor and honesty. It reminds us that no matter how important we think we are, how much we achieve, or how much we own, we are all part of the same procession. We are all holding hands with a skeleton in a dance that has only one destination. It's a grim thought, but it's also a strangely democratic one. And that's why, centuries later, we are still fascinated by the medieval Dance of Death.